Richard Brennan refused to shake the hand of a black woman standing in his executive boardroom. He dismissed her as a low-level employee, turned his back mid-sentence, and never bothered to ask her name. It was a small cruelty, the kind powerful men commit without thought and forget by lunch. But the next morning, $2.1 billion had vanished from Sterling Global's accounts. Because Naomi Rivers wasn't an employee, and she definitely wasn't someone who could be dismissed. She was the architect of the very system that was about to dismantle everything Richard had built, and she tried to warn him. He just hadn't bothered to listen. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sun reflected off the glass tower like a monument to power itself. Sterling Global Enterprises occupied 43 floors of pure corporate dominance in downtown Manhattan, and every polished surface seemed designed to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of greatness. News screens in the marble lobby cycled through headlines praising Chairman Richard Brennan's latest acquisition. Employees moved through the space with practiced efficiency, their voices hushed, their movements careful. This was the kind of place where careers were made and destroyed before lunch, where a single word from the right person could change everything. Naomi Rivers stood in that lobby, adjusting the strap of her leather portfolio. She wore a charcoal suit that spoke of quiet professionalism, her hair pulled back in a simple twist. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything other than prepared. She had a scheduled meeting on the executive floor, confirmed twice by email, yet the receptionist barely glanced at her credentials before directing her to a different elevator bank. Third floor, waiting area B, the woman said, already turning to answer another call. Naomi didn't argue. She simply pressed the button and rode up, noting the shift in atmosphere as the elevator doors opened. This wasn't the executive level. This was where junior vendors waited, where assistants queued for approval signatures, where people who didn't matter were asked to be patient. The chairs were functional rather than comfortable. The magazines were 6 months old. A coffee machine in the corner dispensed something that smelled more like disappointment than caffeine. She took a seat and waited. Around her, the building hummed with tension that didn't match the confident exterior. A legal assistant hurried past, arms full of sealed documents marked with red priority tags. 2 finance managers stood near the elevators, their voices low and urgent. One of them kept glancing at his phone like he expected bad news. Through a partially open conference room door, Naomi caught a glimpse of someone frantically printing pages, checking each one, then printing more. Something was wrong here. The building looked powerful, but it felt fragile. 40 minutes passed before someone finally came to collect her. A young man in an expensive suit that didn't quite fit his nervous energy appeared, checked his tablet, and looked confused. Naomi Rivers? You're here for the capital infrastructure meeting. That's correct. Right, okay. They're ready now. Follow me. The executive boardroom occupied a corner of the 38th floor with views that could make anyone feel insignificant. The table was a single piece of polished walnut that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. Leather chairs surrounded it, each one positioned with mathematical precision. At the head of the table sat Richard Brennan himself, silver-haired and commanding, flanked by executives who looked like they'd been selected for their ability to agree with him. Naomi entered quietly. Introductions were rushed, barely coherent. Names were thrown out without context. She caught a few. Marcus Whitley, the CFO, who had the pinched expression of a man carrying secrets. David Foster, general counsel, who looked at everyone like they might be recording him. 3 board members whose faces blurred together in practiced corporate neutrality. She stepped forward to greet the chairman, extending her hand in the universal language of professional courtesy. Richard Brennan looked at her hand. His eyes traveled from her extended palm to her face, taking in everything about her in one cold assessment. Then he simply turned his attention back to the papers in front of him. "I don't shake hands with low-level employees," he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd said worse and forgotten it by dinner. The room went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then someone laughed. Just a short bark of amusement from one of the board members, quickly stifled. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Marcus Whitley, the CFO, glanced at Naomi with something that might have been embarrassment before looking away. David Foster studied his phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. No one challenged the chairman. No one corrected him. No one did anything at all. Naomi slowly lowered her hand. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't explain. She simply said, understood, and moved toward an empty chair at the table. Before she could sit, an assistant quietly pulled the chair away. Actually, if you could wait over there, the assistant said, gesturing to a row of seats against the wall, until the real investors arrive. The chairman had already turned his back, addressing Marcus about quarterly projections. The conversation resumed as if Naomi had never entered the room. She was dismissed without even the courtesy of being asked to leave. She walked to the chairs against the wall and sat down. From this position, she was close enough to hear everything but far enough to be ignored. One person watched her, though, a young legal analyst seated at the far end of the table, a junior position judging by his placement. He'd seen the entire exchange, and unlike everyone else, he looked disturbed by it. When Naomi met his eyes, he quickly looked down at his notes. The meeting proceeded. Marcus presented financial updates with the enthusiasm of a man describing a terminal diagnosis. International expansion was ahead of schedule, he explained, but required additional capital infrastructure reinforcement. Overseas accounts were being consolidated. Silent partners were being integrated into a new framework. Emergency capital buffers were being established under something called the Phoenix Division. That name made David Foster tense. We're still finalizing the Phoenix protocols, he said carefully. There are some legacy clauses we're reviewing. Legacy? Richard waved a dismissive hand. If it's old framework, just override it. I want clean structures, not archaeological excavations of outdated compliance measures. Sir, some of those clauses were built into the core architecture. Then rebuild the architecture. That's what we pay you for, David. The general counsel fell silent. Around the table, executives took notes, nodded at appropriate moments, and avoided asking questions that might require uncomfortable answers. Naomi listened to all of it. She heard the nervous energy behind Marcus's financial reports. She noted how David kept circling back to transparency requirements that Richard kept dismissing. She watched board members exchange glances that communicated more than their words ever did. This company was powerful, but it was also afraid. The meeting ended an hour later with nothing resolved and everyone pretending otherwise. People gathered their materials and filed out, still not acknowledging Naomi's presence. The young legal analyst lingered, organizing his papers with unnecessary care until the room had mostly cleared. Then he approached her. I'm sorry about that, he said quietly. About what happened. That was wrong. Naomi stood, gathering her portfolio. It's not your apology to make. Still, he hesitated, then lowered his voice further. You shouldn't be here. Whatever you came for, whatever business you thought you had with Sterling Global, this place isn't clean. There are things happening, things being hidden. If you have other options, I'd take them. She looked at him for a long moment. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of idealism that hadn't been completely crushed yet. His warning was genuine. What's your name? She asked. Thomas. Thomas Blake. Thank you for the warning, Thomas. She paused. I know. His eyes widened slightly. You know? Then why? But she was already walking toward the door. Thomas watched her go, confused and unsettled by a response that answered nothing. That evening, Naomi sat in her hotel room as the city lights flickered on across Manhattan. Her laptop was open, displaying a series of interconnected dashboards that would have made most financial analysts dizzy. Capital flowcharts, entity relationship maps, compliance trigger systems, legal framework architectures, shell partnerships, and trust structures branching out like a digital nervous system. She'd spent the day being treated as irrelevant. She'd been dismissed, humiliated, and ignored by people who never bothered to ask who she actually was. None of that showed on her face now. She simply worked, clicking through screens, verifying connections, checking dates and signatures against stored records. At 10:30, She reached for her phone and dialed a number she'd been avoiding all day. The man who answered sounded tired. "Is it done?" "Not yet," Naomi said softly. "But it will be. Tomorrow morning, it starts." She hung up before he could respond. For a moment, she sat in the quiet darkness of the hotel room, looking at the screens without really seeing them. Then she closed the laptop, shut off the lights, and tried to sleep. Some decisions, once made, couldn't be unmade. Tomorrow would prove whether she'd made the right one. The story of how Naomi Rivers became the architect of corporate safeguards began 7 years earlier in a different city with different stakes, but the same fundamental problem. She'd been younger then, working inside financial infrastructure, not as an employee of any single company, but as a specialized consultant. Her firm designed the invisible systems that kept money safe during crises. Capital migration structures, compliance automation, emergency withdrawal frameworks. The kind of architecture that no one thought about until everything fell apart. Sterling Global had been one of their clients, back when Brennan was still consolidating his empire through aggressive international expansion. His team needed a system that could protect emergency reserves, isolate capital during hostile market conditions, and provide automatic fail-safes if internal oversight collapsed. They wanted something bulletproof, something that couldn't be touched by boardroom politics or executive interference. Naomi's firm built exactly that. They called it Phoenix. The architecture was elegant in its simplicity. A series of interlocking trusts, partnerships, and legal entities that created a protected capital reserve. Under normal conditions, it remained dormant, invisible, integrated into the company's regular financial infrastructure. But if certain conditions were triggered, transparency violations, compliance failures, emergency restructures that concealed material risk, the system would activate automatically. Protected funds would migrate out of corporate control into an independent trust designed to preserve capital for creditors, employees, and partners if the company began to collapse. It was insurance against executive arrogance. A dead man switch built into the foundation. Naomi had designed most of it herself. Her name appeared on the original contracts, buried under 3 layers of shell partnerships and consulting agreements. Sterling Global's legal team had reviewed everything, signed off on every clause, and promptly forgot about it. The system was too complex to understand without significant effort, and executives rarely put in that effort for infrastructure they hoped never to use. That was 7 years ago. Naomi had moved on to other projects, other companies, other systems. Sterling Global became just another name in her portfolio of past clients. She'd never planned to return. Then, 6 months ago, she'd received a routine notification from an automated monitoring system she'd built into Phoenix. Sterling Global had begun showing signs of internal instability. Compliance reviews were being delayed. Financial disclosures were becoming vague. Risk assessments were being rewritten by executives rather than auditors. Small warning signs that individually meant little, but together painted a troubling picture. She'd started investigating quietly. The more she looked, the worse it became. Marcus Whitley, the CFO, was hiding losses in overseas partnerships. David Foster was sealing evidence of inflated performance reports. Board members were selling stock through family trusts while publicly praising the company's strength. The entire executive structure was engaged in a slow-motion cover-up of problems they refused to address. And Brennan, the chairman, was approving everything without reading the details. 3 weeks ago, he'd signed a restructuring memo that activated the first Phoenix trigger. The memo authorized emergency capital consolidation without independent audit review. It was exactly the kind of executive overreach the system was designed to catch. Naomi had seen the notification and realized what was about to happen. She tried to warn them. She'd sent formal notices through the emergency legal channels she'd built into the architecture. She'd requested meetings with senior leadership. She'd even reached out to David Foster directly, reminding him that Phoenix existed and needed review. Every warning had been ignored or routed to junior staff who didn't understand what they were looking at. So she'd flown to New York. She'd scheduled a meeting using the credentials from her original consulting contract. She'd come prepared to explain the situation face to face, to show them how close they were to triggering an automatic capital extraction that would devastate the company's financial foundation. Instead, Richard Brennan had refused to shake her hand and dismissed her as a low-level employee. Now, the morning after that humiliation, Naomi sat in a different coffee shop reviewing documents that Richard would never see. The Phoenix framework was activating exactly as designed. Every arrogant decision, every overlooked warning, every suppressed compliance review had added another trigger point. The system didn't care about intentions or excuses. It only responded to what actually happened. She pulled up the activation timeline. The restructuring memo Richard signed had fulfilled the primary trigger. The company-wide email he'd sent 3 days ago, threatening terminations over alleged leaks, demanding absolute loyalty without question, had fulfilled a secondary transparency violation trigger. His approval of emergency budget reallocations that bypassed standard oversight had fulfilled a third. The system was already moving. Naomi couldn't stop it now, even if she wanted to. Phoenix had been designed to be unstoppable precisely because companies in crisis always try to stop emergency measures that threatened executive control. Her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Blake, the junior legal analyst who'd warned her yesterday. Need to talk. Found something. Can you meet? She typed back. Where? Coffee place on West 49th. 1 hour. Come alone. Naomi paid for her coffee and left. 53 minutes later, she walked into a small cafe that catered to office workers on their breaks. Thomas was already there, looking exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. Papers were spread across the table in front of him, covered in his handwriting. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure you would. What did you find?" Thomas glanced around nervously before answering. "I've been running compliance audits for the past 6 months. Routine stuff mostly, but I started noticing discrepancies in our capital reserve structures. Money that should have been in primary accounts was showing up in offshore buffers under different entity names. Well, I asked Marcus about it. He told me it was legacy restructuring and not to worry. But you worried anyway." I kept digging. He pushed a printout toward her. "These are capital flow charts for the past 18 months. See these transactions? They're all moving through shell partnerships I've never heard of before. Partnerships that don't appear on any of our standard org charts." Naomi looked at the documents without touching them. She recognized every entity name. They were all part of Phoenix. "Did you show this to anyone?" "I tried. David Foster told me I was looking at decommissioned frameworks and a focus on current infrastructure. But these aren't decommissioned. They're active, and they're moving money." "How much money?" Thomas met her eyes. "As of this morning, $2.1 billion. The number hung in the air between them. Naomi kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. Phoenix had already begun the primary capital migration. The system was pulling protected reserves out of corporate control and into the independent trust structure. It was happening faster than she'd anticipated. "There's something else," Thomas continued. "I traced the original architecture design for these partnerships. They were built by an outside consulting firm 7 years ago." "Your firm?" Naomi said nothing. "You're not an employee. You're not even an investor. You're one of the people who built Sterling Global's emergency infrastructure. That's why you came, isn't it? Not to invest. To warn us." "Yes. And now something you built is activating." "Yes." Thomas leaned back, processing this. "Can you stop it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because the system was designed to be unstoppable once triggered. Companies in crisis always try to override emergency measures. Phoenix was built to prevent that. It requires unanimous board approval plus independent regulatory review to halt, and only before the final execution phase begins. After that, it's automatic. When does the final phase begin? Naomi checked her watch. 4 hours ago. Thomas went pale. What happens when it finishes? $2.1 billion legally migrates out of Sterling Global's control into an independent capital protection trust. The company loses access to its emergency reserves. If they're already unstable, which they are, this will force immediate disclosure of their real financial situation. Regulators will investigate. The entire executive structure will come under scrutiny, and thousands of people will lose their jobs. That's why I came to warn them. That's why I sent notifications through every emergency channel I could. That's why I requested meetings with senior leadership. Naomi's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. I tried everything. Your chairman refused to even shake my hand. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "What do we do now? I can't just watch this happen. If there's any way to minimize the damage, to protect the people who didn't cause this mess, I want to help." Naomi studied him. Young, idealistic, genuinely concerned about the right things. The kind of person who reminded her why she'd built Phoenix in the first place. The system can't be stopped, she said, but it can be guided. Phoenix wasn't designed to destroy Sterling Global. It was designed to protect what matters when executives stop caring about anything except their own power. If we're smart about what happens next, we can make sure the right people are protected. Ow! First, you need to understand what Phoenix actually is. Naomi pulled out her laptop and opened it to a schematic that made Thomas's earlier capital flowcharts look like kindergarten drawings. This is the complete architecture. Every entity, every trust, every legal framework. Phoenix isn't stealing money. It's isolating it, creating a firewall between protected capital and executive control. She clicked through screens, showing him how the system worked, how compliance triggers activated migration protocols, how internal violations fulfilled conditions that executives had personally approved years earlier, how the entire structure was built on their own legal framework, using their own signatures, following their own rules. "It's brilliant," Thomas whispered. "It's necessary," Naomi corrected. 7 years ago, I watched a similar company collapse. Executives looted what they could and disappeared while everyone else suffered. My father was a risk officer at that company. He tried to warn them about the same problems I saw at Sterling Global. They fired him, destroyed his reputation, and walked away clean while he lost everything. Thomas looked at her with new understanding. This is personal. This is justice. Phoenix was my answer to a system that protects powerful people while sacrificing everyone else. It took me 3 years to design and another 2 to find companies willing to implement it. Sterling Global was the first full deployment, and now it's actually working. Yes, now we find out if I build it right. They spent the next hour going through contingency plans. Thomas would continue his compliance audits, documenting every violation he found. Naomi would prepare formal notifications for regulators, giving them the roadmap they'd need to understand what Phoenix had done and why. Together, they would ensure that when the system finished its work, the people who mattered most, employees, contractors, legitimate partners, would be protected. At 2:14 in the morning, Naomi's laptop displayed a new notification. Stage 1 complete. Executive override disabled. Proceeding to Stage 2. The countdown had begun. By market open tomorrow, Sterling Global would discover that $2.1 billion had legally, irreversibly, undeniably vanished from their control. And Richard Brennan, the chairman who'd refused to shake a low-level employee's hand, would finally learn who she actually was. Naomi closed her laptop and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. They didn't fix it. They'd had every opportunity, every warning, every chance to avoid this outcome. And they'd chosen arrogance over attention, dismissal over diligence, contempt over caution. Tomorrow morning would teach them the cost of that choice. Outside, Manhattan slept, unaware that by sunrise, one of its most powerful corporations would be scrambling to understand how invisible architecture could quietly dismantle an empire while following every rule the empire itself had written. Phoenix was rising, and there was nothing Richard Brennan could do to stop it. Thomas Blake left the coffee shop with documents he wasn't supposed to have and knowledge that made him a liability. Naomi Rivers watched him disappear into the Manhattan crowds, wondering if she'd just made his life more dangerous or given him the tools to survive what was coming. Either way, the choice was made. Phoenix was in motion, and by this time tomorrow, Sterling Global would be a very different company. The rest of that day moved with strange slowness. Naomi returned to her hotel and worked through contingency scenarios, preparing documentation for regulators, mapping out protection strategies for employees who'd done nothing wrong but work for the wrong company. She made encrypted backups of everything, distributed copies to secure locations, and ensured that even if Sterling Global tried to bury the evidence, the truth would survive. As afternoon bled into evening, Richard Brennan was preparing for something entirely different. The chairman stood in his penthouse office, adjusting his tie in a mirror that reflected a man who'd never seriously questioned his own judgment. Tonight was the annual Sterling Global Leadership Gala, a black-tie event where the company celebrated its successes and Richard accepted praise from investors who believed every word of his quarterly reports. The event was held at the Plaza, in a ballroom that cost more to rent for one night than most people earn a year. Richard looked forward to these evenings. They reminded him why he'd built this empire, why he'd crushed competitors and absorbed smaller companies and positioned Sterling Global as a titan of international finance. The applause felt like validation. The champagne tasted like victory. The way people hung on his every word confirmed what he'd always believed, that he was simply better at this than everyone else. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Sir, the cars are ready. Also, Marcus wants a moment before you leave. Tell him I'll see him at the venue. I'm not discussing quarterly projections in a tuxedo. He says it's urgent." Richard sighed and waved Marcus in. The CFO entered looking worse than he had that morning, his face pale and drawn despite the expensive suit he wore. He carried a tablet that he clutched like a lifeline. "Richard, we need to talk about the Phoenix protocols." "Not this again. David already told me those are legacy systems we're phasing out." "They're not phased out. They're active. And something's happening with the capital reserves." "What do you mean, something's happening?" Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There are transactions occurring in the offshore protection accounts. Large movements. I can't access the authorization codes, and when I try to halt the transfers, the system locked me out." Richard felt the first flicker of irritation. "Then override it. You're the CFO. Those are our accounts." "I tried. The system won't accept executive override. It's following protocols we established years ago, but I don't remember these specific conditions." "Then call whoever built the system and have them explain it." "That's the problem. The firm that designed Phoenix was a boutique consulting group. They dissolved 3 years ago. The principals scattered. I have no way to reach them." Richard checked his watch. The gala started in 40 minutes. He had a speech to give, donors to charm, board members to reassure. He did not have time for Marcus's technical anxieties about systems that had been running fine for years. "Marcus, if the money is moving through our own protocols, then it's doing what it's supposed to do. We'll review it Monday morning with full legal. Right now, I have 300 investors waiting to hear why Sterling Global just posted record stability numbers." "But Richard—" "Monday, Marcus. That's final." The CFO stood there for a moment longer, clearly wanting to say more, then simply nodded and left. Richard dismissed the entire conversation from his mind as he headed to the elevator. Whatever technical glitch Marcus had discovered could wait. Tonight was about celebration, about showing the world that Sterling Global was untouchable. The gala was everything Richard expected. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and elegant flower arrangements. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns moved through the space with practiced grace. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost $50 per bite. Richard worked the room like the professional he was, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, delivering perfectly crafted sound bites about Sterling Global's bright future. Board members laughed at his jokes. Investors nodded approvingly at his confidence. A journalist from the Financial Times asked about international expansion plans, and Richard gave her the kind of quote that would look perfect in tomorrow's headline. At 9 o'clock, he took the stage to deliver his keynote address. The ballroom quieted. All eyes turned toward him. This was the moment he lived for, when hundreds of people hung on his words, when his vision for the company became the only truth that mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight," Richard began, his voice carrying easily across the space. "When I founded Sterling Global 23 years ago, I had a simple vision: to build a company that didn't just participate in global finance, but defined it. Tonight, I'm proud to say we've exceeded even my own ambitious expectations." Applause rippled through the crowd. Richard smiled and continued, laying out numbers that painted Sterling Global as unstoppable. Growth projections, market dominance, strategic acquisitions. Everything sounded perfect because he'd made sure it sounded perfect. The truth was more complicated, but truth was for accountants to worry about. His job was to project strength. While Richard spoke, Marcus Whitley sat at a corner table, barely touching his food. His phone was face down next to his plate, but he kept glancing at it, waiting for alerts he couldn't silence and didn't want to see. Across the room, David Foster stood near the bar, nursing a scotch and looking like a man at his own funeral. A few board members noticed the general counsel's expression and made mental notes to ask questions on Monday. Beneath the celebration, beneath the champagne toasts and confident speeches, Sterling Global's infrastructure was experiencing something none of them understood. In server rooms that hummed quietly beneath the Manhattan office, automated systems were executing commands they'd been programmed to follow years earlier. Capital transfer protocols activated. Migration sequences initialized. Legal frameworks shifted into configurations that corporate executives no longer controlled. Phoenix was waking up. At midnight, after the gala had ended and Richard had returned to his penthouse satisfied with another successful performance, Naomi received a notification on her laptop. She'd been half dozing in her hotel room, knowing sleep would be difficult tonight, when the screen lit up with an update that made her sit up immediately. Stage 2 complete. Capital isolation finalized. Legal framework locked. Executive override permanently disabled. Final execution. Market open. She stared at those words for a long moment. There was no going back now. At 9:30 tomorrow morning, when markets opened and Sterling Global's Treasury Department ran their standard daily verification checks, they would discover that $2.1 billion had legally separated from corporate control. Not stolen, not hacked, simply withdrawn according to protocols the company itself had authorized. Naomi picked up her phone and called the same number she'd dialed the night before. The man answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. "It's happening," she said softly. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. Market open." A long pause. Then, in a voice rough with emotion, "Will it work?" "Yes. Everything is locked. They can't stop it now. And after? When they come looking for someone to blame, let them come. Everything I did was legal. Everything Phoenix does follows their own rules. They signed off on every clause, every condition, every trigger. This isn't revenge, Dad. It's accountability." Her father was quiet for another moment. "Your mother will be proud. I'm proud. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be difficult. For them, maybe. For us, it's been a long time coming." Naomi hung up and sat in the darkness of her hotel room, thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. 7 years of planning, 3 years of design work, countless hours building architecture that would outlast executive arrogance and survive corporate cover-ups. She'd poured everything she knew about financial systems into Phoenix, creating something that couldn't be corrupted or controlled or dismissed by people who thought their titles made them invincible. Tomorrow, Richard Brennan would learn what she already knew. That power wasn't about who sat at the head of the table. It was about who built the table in the first place. At 4:46 in the morning, while Manhattan slept and markets prepared for another day of trading, the final safeguards disengaged. Phoenix entered its execution phase. The system that had been dormant for 7 years, waiting patiently for conditions that its creators hoped would never occur, began the largest automated capital extraction in corporate history. And there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it. Richard Brennan woke at 6:30 to his usual routine. Coffee, news briefing, morning workout. He scanned headlines on his tablet while a personal chef prepared breakfast. The Financial Times had run the quote he'd given them last night, exactly as he'd hoped. The Wall Street Journal mentioned Sterling Global in a positive roundup of quarterly earnings. Everything looked perfect. He arrived at his office at 8, moving through the morning with the confidence of a man who'd never seriously failed at anything that mattered. His assistant had already organized his schedule, morning calls with international partners, Afternoon meeting with the board's acquisition committee, evening dinner with potential investors. A full day, but manageable. At 8:45, Marcus Whitley appeared in his doorway, and Richard knew immediately that something was wrong. The CFO looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked. His hands were shaking. "Richard, we have a serious problem. It's not even 9 o'clock, Marcus. How bad can it be? Treasury just called. They can't access the primary reserve accounts." Richard set down his coffee. "What do you mean they can't access them?" "The system is showing the accounts as locked, unavailable for transaction. When they tried to run the morning verification protocols, everything came back with authorization errors. Then call IT and have them fix it. IT says it's not a technical problem. It's a legal one. The accounts aren't frozen. They're gone." The word hung in the air between them. Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he kept his voice level. "Gone where? That's what we're trying to figure out. How about the entire finance team pulling records right now? All I know is that as of market open this morning, we have zero available balance in our emergency capital reserves." Richard stood, his morning routine forgotten. Get David Foster and the full executive team in the main conference room. Now, 20 minutes later, the conference room was full of people who looked progressively more panicked as they understood what they were facing. David Foster had brought 3 members of his legal team, all of them clutching tablets and looking grim. Marcus had his entire senior finance staff present. Board members who'd been called in from breakfast meetings crowded around the table. Everyone was talking at once, voices rising, phones ringing, keyboards clicking as people desperately searched for answers. Richard stood at the head of the table and demanded silence. "Someone explain to me, in clear terms, what exactly has happened." Marcus pulled up a display on the main screen. It showed Sterling Global's capital structure, with several accounts highlighted in red. "These are our primary emergency reserve accounts. Protected capital that we maintain for crisis situations. As of 9:30 this morning, all of them show zero available balance. $2.1 billion has migrated out of corporate control." The number landed like a physical blow. Several people started talking at once, but Richard cut them off. "Migrated where? Money doesn't just disappear." David Foster spoke up, his voice tight. "It didn't disappear. It was extracted, legally extracted, following protocols we established years ago." "What protocols?" "Phoenix protocols. The emergency capital protection framework we implemented during the international expansion. It was designed to isolate reserves if the company showed signs of internal collapse or compliance failure." Richard felt his face flush. "And someone activated it? Who? I want names, I want evidence, and I want it now." "That's the problem, sir. No one activated it. It activated automatically. The system was monitoring for specific conditions: transparency violations, compliance failures, executive overrides of standard oversight. When those conditions were met, Phoenix initiated capital migration without requiring human authorization." "That's impossible. I would never have approved a system that could act without my direct control." David slid a document across the table. "This is your signature on the original Phoenix implementation agreement. Right here, you approved autonomous operation specifically to prevent executive interference during crisis situations." Richard stared at his own signature, trying to remember a meeting from 7 years ago that he'd probably spent half listening to while checking email. He signed hundreds of documents a month. How was he supposed to remember every clause in every agreement? Then override it. Shut it down. Whatever it takes. "We can't." The system entered execution phase at market open. According to the legal framework, once execution begins, it requires unanimous board approval plus independent regulatory review to halt. Even then, only before capital transfer completes. The transfer finished 3 minutes ago. The room went silent. Richard looked around the table at executives who suddenly wouldn't meet his eyes. "So you're telling me that $2.1 billion just left Sterling Global's control, and there's nothing we could do about it?" "Not exactly." David pulled up another screen. "The money didn't leave our legal structure. It migrated into an independent capital protection trust that was established as part of the Phoenix architecture. The trust is technically a Sterling Global entity, but it's outside executive control. It has its own governance structure, its own oversight board, and its own operational authority. Who controls this trust? That's complicated. The trust was designed to be autonomous. It has trustees, but they operate under strict legal parameters. They can't simply return the capital without meeting specific conditions related to corporate transparency and compliance reform. Richard felt control slipping through his fingers. This was his company, his money, his authority, and some automated system designed by consultants he barely remembered was suddenly treating him like he didn't matter. Find out who built Phoenix. I want them in this office by end of business today. One of the junior legal analysts, a young man Richard didn't recognize, spoke up quietly. Sir, we already know who built it. The primary architect was Naomi Rivers, working for Riverside Financial Architecture Group. The name meant nothing to Richard for a moment. Then he remembered. The woman from yesterday. The one he dismissed. The one whose hand he'd refused to shake. The woman from the meeting, he said slowly. Yes, sir. She designed Phoenix 7 years ago. Her firm worked with our legal team to implement it. Her name is on all the original documentation. Richard's mind was racing. That woman wasn't some low-level employee. She was the person who'd built the system that was now dismantling his company's financial foundation. She'd come to his office, tried to introduce herself, and he'd humiliated her in front of his entire executive team. Where is she now? We don't know. She left the building yesterday after the meeting. We have no record of follow-up contact. Marcus leaned forward. Richard, we need to make a decision about disclosure. The markets opened 40 minutes ago. If word gets out that we've lost access to $2 billion in reserve capital, our stock price will... Don't tell me about stock prices right now, Marcus. I need solutions, not predictions. Then here's a solution. We find Naomi Rivers, and we convince her to undo whatever this system is doing. David shook his head. It's not that simple. Phoenix is automated. Even if she wanted to stop it, I'm not sure she could at this point. Then we make her want to stop it. Offer her money. Offer her a position. Offer her whatever it takes. One of the board members, an older woman named Patricia Thornton, spoke up for the first time. Richard, perhaps we should consider why Phoenix activated in the first place. The system was designed to respond to internal problems. If it triggered, maybe we should be asking what problems it detected. Richard turned to her, his voice sharp. Are you seriously suggesting that this is our fault? I'm suggesting that automated systems don't act randomly. They follow their programming. If Phoenix determined that Sterling Global was experiencing transparency violations and compliance failures serious enough to warrant capital isolation, then maybe we need to examine whether those determinations were accurate. This is not the time for corporate soul-searching, Patricia. This is the time for damage control. But even as Richard said it, he could see doubt spreading around the table. People were starting to ask questions, starting to wonder what exactly Phoenix had detected, starting to look at each other with suspicion, wondering who knew what and who was hiding what. His assistant appeared in the doorway, looking shaken. Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent. I'm in the middle of a crisis. Tell them to schedule an appointment. Sir, it's Naomi Rivers. She says she has information about the Phoenix situation. The room went completely still. Richard looked at his executive team, saw his own shock reflected in their faces, and made a decision. Send her in. 2 minutes later, Naomi Rivers walked into the conference room where Richard Brennan had humiliated her less than 24 hours earlier. She looked exactly the same, calm, professional, unhurried. She carried the same leather portfolio. She wore a different suit, but the same expression of quiet competence. Nothing about her suggested she'd just orchestrated the largest corporate financial extraction in recent memory. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply walked to an empty chair, set down her portfolio, and looked at Richard with the patient expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. Good morning, Mr. Brennan. I believe we have a great deal to discuss. Richard stared at her, fury and confusion warring in his chest. This woman, this consultant he dismissed as irrelevant, had somehow brought his entire empire to its knees before lunch. And she was sitting in his conference room like she'd been invited. Who are you? He asked, and this time he actually wanted to know the answer. Naomi smiled just slightly. I'm one of the people who built what just activated. And before you ask your next question, no, I can't stop it. But I can explain it. And if you're willing to listen, really listen this time, I might be able to help you understand why this is happening and what happens next. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a thin folder, placing on the table where everyone could see it. This is the original Phoenix implementation agreement. Your signature is on page 7, along with signatures from your legal team, your CFO, and 3 board members. You authorized everything that happened this morning. You just never bothered to understand what you were authorizing. Richard wanted to shout, to throw her out, to call security and have her removed from his building. But he couldn't, because she was right. He had signed that agreement. He had approved Phoenix without reading the details. And now she was the only person in the room who actually understood what was happening to his company. So instead of shouting, he sat down. And for the first time in his career, Richard Brennan prepared to listen to someone he dismissed as beneath his notice explained exactly how much power he never actually had. Outside the conference room, Sterling Global employees went about their morning routines, unaware that in the executive suite above them, their company's future was being decided by a woman their chairman had refused to shake hands with just yesterday. In server rooms and backup facilities, Phoenix continued its work, cold and patient and completely unstoppable. The money wasn't coming back, and by the end of the day, everyone would know it. The conference room had never felt smaller. Richard Brennan sat at the head of the table, where he'd made decisions that moved billions of dollars, where he'd approved acquisitions that destroyed competitors, where he'd built an empire on the assumption that his authority was absolute. Now, that same table held a single folder that proved he'd never understood the foundation his empire rested on. Naomi Rivers sat calmly, her hands folded on the table, waiting. Around her, Sterling Global's executive team shifted uncomfortably. Marcus Whitley looked like he might be sick. David Foster kept adjusting his glasses, a nervous habit he'd never managed to break. The board members present exchanged glances that communicated more than words ever could. Everyone wanted answers, but no one knew what questions to ask. Richard had ordered the floor cleared. Only the essential people remained. The CFO, general counsel, 3 board members including Patricia Thornton, and 2 senior lawyers who'd been frantically reviewing documentation since the crisis began. Security stood outside the door, ensuring privacy for a conversation that could determine whether Sterling Global survived the week. "Who are you?" Richard asked again, and this time the question carried different weight. Not dismissive, not rhetorical, genuine. Naomi met his eyes without flinching. "My name is Naomi Rivers. 7 years ago, I worked for Riverside Financial Architecture Group as their lead systems designer. My firm specialized in building emergency capital protection frameworks for companies undergoing rapid international expansion. You hired us because you wanted safeguards that couldn't be compromised by internal politics or executive interference. I don't remember hiring you. You didn't. Your legal team did. You signed the implementation agreement without reading it, which is what you did with most technical infrastructure documentation. I know because I watched you approve 3 other major system upgrades the same day. You approved Phoenix, and you spent approximately 30 seconds reviewing each one." David Foster winced. He'd been in that meeting. He remembered Richard's impatience with technical details, his insistence that experts handle the specifics while he focused on strategy. At the time, it had seemed like efficient delegation. Now it looked like negligence. "So you built this Phoenix system," Richard said slowly. "You designed it to steal our money." "No." Naomi's voice remained calm, but carried an edge now. "I designed it to protect your stakeholders when executive decision-making became compromised. Phoenix doesn't steal. It isolates. It creates a firewall between protected capital and corporate control when specific conditions are met." "What conditions?" "Internal transparency violations. Emergency restructures that conceal material risk. Executive overrides of compliance review. All conditions that you and your team triggered over the past 6 months." Marcus leaned forward, his voice shaking slightly. "You're saying we did this to ourselves?" "I'm saying the system responded exactly as designed to the decisions you made." Phoenix monitored for patterns that indicated executive leadership was prioritizing image over accuracy, control over oversight, and short-term protection over long-term stability. When those patterns reached critical thresholds, the system activated. Patricia Thornton spoke up, her tone measured. "Can you be more specific about what triggered activation?" Naomi pulled several documents from her portfolio, sliding them across the table. 3 months ago, Mr. Brennan signed a restructuring memo that authorized emergency capital consolidation without independent audit review. That fulfilled the first trigger condition. 6 weeks ago, your CFO reclassified significant overseas losses as temporary liquidity adjustments, concealing them from standard disclosure requirements. Second condition. 3 weeks ago, your general counsel sealed internal compliance reports that documented systematic oversight failures. Third condition. She paused, letting that information settle before continuing. Then, 2 weeks ago, Mr. Brennan sent a company-wide email threatening terminations over alleged leaks and demanding absolute loyalty without question. That fulfilled a transparency violation trigger. Finally, 8 days ago, he approved emergency budget reallocations that bypassed standard oversight protocols. That was the final condition. The room was silent. Every person present had known about at least some of these decisions. Several had participated in them. None had connected them to an automated system that was quietly counting violations and preparing to respond. "You're telling me this system was watching us?" Richard's voice carried disbelief and anger in equal measure. The system was monitoring publicly available internal data streams that you specifically authorized it to access when you signed the implementation agreement. Phoenix doesn't spy. It observes what you told it to observe and responds according to rules you approved. David Foster removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Why didn't we know about this? Why wasn't there oversight? There was oversight. I sent 3 formal notifications through the emergency legal channels that Phoenix architecture includes. I flagged the restructuring memo immediately after it was signed. I sent detailed warnings when the CFO's reclassifications triggered the second condition. I requested an urgent review meeting when the compliance reports were sealed. We never received those notifications. Your junior staff received them and routed them according to standard procedures for technical infrastructure alerts. They went to IT, who forwarded them to legal, who marked them as low-priority legacy system maintenance. No one with authority to act ever saw them, because your organizational structure assumes that anything technical is beneath executive attention. The accusation hung in the air. Richard wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. She was describing exactly how his company operated. Technical details were for specialists to handle. Executives made strategic decisions. That division of labor had worked perfectly for decades, until it hadn't. "So you came here yesterday," Richard said slowly. "You came to warn us in person." "Yes, and I refused to shake your hand. I dismissed you as a low-level employee." "Yes. Why didn't you explain who you were? Why didn't you force the issue?" Naomi's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I tried to introduce myself. You turned your back mid-sentence. Your assistant physically moved me away from the table. I was told to wait for the real investors to arrive. At what point in that interaction was I supposed to force anything?" Richard had no answer. He remembered the moment clearly now, remembered dismissing her without thought, without question, without even basic courtesy. It had been automatic, instinctive, the kind of casual cruelty that powerful people inflicted without even noticing because the targets didn't matter enough to remember. "The money," Marcus said, desperately trying to redirect the conversation towards something actionable. "The $2.1 billion. Where did it go?" "It transferred into an independent capital protection trust that was established as part of the original Phoenix architecture. The trust is a sterling global entity, but it operates outside executive control. It has its own governance structure, its own legal framework, and its own operational mandate." "What mandate?" "To protect stakeholders in the event of corporate collapse. The trust now holds sufficient capital to guarantee pension obligations, fulfill contractor agreements, settle legitimate creditor claims, and maintain critical operations if Sterling Global's financial structure fails. Patricia leaned back in her chair, processing this. So the money isn't gone. It's in escrow. Essentially, yes. But it's not accessible to corporate executives. The trust operates independently, guided by fiduciary responsibility to stakeholders rather than shareholder value. Can we get it back? That depends on what happens next. Richard slammed his hand on the table, the first truly emotional gesture he'd made since Naomi entered the room. This is extortion. You're holding our money hostage until we do what you want. No, Mr. Brennan. This is accountability. I'm not holding anything hostage. The trust holds capital and protection until Sterling Global demonstrates that executive leadership can be trusted with it again. That trust was created with your approval, funded with your authorization, and operates under rules you signed. I didn't trap you. You built the trap yourself, and I just watched you walk into it. The distinction seemed lost on Richard, but Patricia understood it immediately. What would it take for the trust to release the capital? Naomi pulled out another document, this one much thicker. The trust has specific requirements for capital release. Executive suspension pending investigation. Board restructuring with independent oversight. Public disclosure of all material risks and compliance failures. Victim restitution for employees and contractors harmed by concealed instability. And most importantly, implementation of permanent governance reforms that prevent this kind of executive overreach from occurring again. That would destroy the company, Marcus said quietly. No, it would transform the company. Destruction is what happens if you refuse these requirements and let the current trajectory continue. Right now, Sterling Global looks stable to outsiders, but internal rot is spreading. Phoenix activation was a symptom, not the disease. The disease is an executive culture that values control over truth and protects power over people. David Foster spoke up, his voice careful. You keep saying Phoenix activated automatically, but you're here. You're making demands. That suggests you have more control over the situation than you're admitting. I have influence, not control. The trust operates independently, but I designed its framework. I know how it thinks, how it responds, what it prioritizes. I can guide the process, but I can't override it. Even if I wanted to return the money immediately, I couldn't do it without meeting the trust conditions. Why would you want to return it? You said yourself my father's career was destroyed by people like us. The words came from Thomas Blake, who just entered the conference room despite not being invited. He looked exhausted but determined, carrying a laptop that he set on the table with deliberate care. Richard started to order him out, but Naomi raised a hand. It's all right. Thomas has been helping me prepare regulatory documentation. You should hear this. Helping you. David stood abruptly. Thomas, you're supposed to be on our side. I am on our side. That's why I've been documenting the compliance failures that triggered Phoenix in the first place. Someone needed to care about what was actually happening instead of what we were pretending was happening. Richard looked at his junior legal analyst with something close to betrayal. How long have you been working with her? Since yesterday afternoon, when I realized she wasn't an employee or an investor, but the architect of a system that might be the only thing standing between Sterling Global and complete collapse. Naomi gestured for Thomas to sit. To answer your question, Thomas, you're right that my father's career was destroyed by executives who prioritized their own protection over accountability. But Phoenix wasn't designed for revenge. It was designed to prevent what happened to him from happening to others. The goal isn't to destroy Sterling Global. The goal is to force it to become what it claims to be, a responsible corporate entity that protects its stakeholders. By stealing $2 billion, Richard said bitterly. By isolating $2 billion that you would have used to maintain the illusion of stability while internal problems festered. Mr. Brennan, do you know how many employees Sterling Global has? Approximately 43,000 globally. Do you know how many of them would lose their pensions if this company collapsed under the weight of concealed losses and deferred accountability? Richard didn't answer. All of them, Naomi said quietly. Every single one. Because pension obligations are among the first things abandoned in corporate bankruptcy. The Phoenix Trust ensures that won't happen. That money is now protected in their interest, not yours. Patricia's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression changed immediately. Richard, we have another problem. Financial journalists are reporting unusual capital movements at Sterling Global. Someone leaked. Who? Does it matter? The story is out. We have maybe an hour before markets respond. Marcus looked like he might pass out. If investors think we've lost control of our capital reserves, the stock price will crash. We'll lose billions in market value by close of trading. Then we need to control the narrative, David said, already pulling up his phone to call the communications team. No. Naomi's single word stopped everyone. You need to tell the truth. The truth will destroy us, Richard said. The lie is already destroying you. Phoenix activated because your company prioritized appearance over reality for too long. If you respond to this crisis with more deception, more image management, more desperate attempts to maintain control, you'll only prove that the system was right to intervene. You're asking us to commit corporate suicide. I'm asking you to choose correction over collapse. There's a difference. Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out over Manhattan. From this height, the city looked orderly, manageable, contained. He'd built his empire on the belief that appearance and reality were the same thing, that projecting strength was the same as being strong, that control was the same as competence. Now a woman he dismissed as irrelevant was calmly explaining that everything he'd built rested on foundations he'd never bothered to understand. He turned back to face the room. What happens if we refuse? If we fight this in court? If we challenge the trust authority? If we do everything in our power to regain control of that capital? Naomi met his eyes steadily. Then by tomorrow morning, regulators will have complete documentation of every compliance failure, every concealed loss, every oversight violation that triggered Phoenix activation. They'll have internal emails, financial records, sealed reports, and testimony from employees like Thomas who've been documenting problems for months. Sterling Global will face investigations that make today's crisis look manageable. Your reputation will shift from visionary leader to negligent executive, and the trust will deploy its resources to ensure that stakeholders are protected during the collapse you refuse to prevent. That's a threat. That's a consequence. I didn't create this situation, Mr. Brennan. You did. Every decision, every dismissal, every time you prioritize control over listening, you built toward this moment. I just designed a system that would respond when you finally went too far. The silence that followed felt infinite. Then Patricia spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. I move that we accept the trust conditions. Richard spun to face her. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Naomi is right. We have a choice between correction and collapse, and I choose correction. If that means executive suspension and board restructuring, so be it. Better to rebuild with integrity than to maintain power built on deception. Patricia, you're talking about destroying everything we've built. No, Richard. I'm talking about saving what matters and letting go of what doesn't. You built an empire, but you build it on sand. Phoenix is offering us a chance to build something better before the tide comes in. Marcus looked torn, clearly wanting to support his chairman, but unable to deny the logic. David Foster studied his hands, saying nothing. The other board members present exchanged glances, and Richard could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. They were already deciding whether to support him or abandon him. Naomi stood, gathering her documents. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to make a decision. The trust has authority to begin regulatory disclosure at any time, but I can delay that process if you're willing to cooperate. Use the time wisely. Where are you going? Richard demanded. To prepare the documentation you'll need regardless of which choice you make. If you choose cooperation, you'll need detailed transition plans and governance reforms. If you choose resistance, you'll need that regulatory disclosure I mentioned. Either way, the work doesn't stop. She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Richard. Yesterday, when I held out my hand, I was offering you a chance to avoid this moment. Not because I needed your approval, but because I genuinely hoped Phoenix would never have to activate. I spent 7 years building a system designed to intervene only when everything else failed. The fact that we're standing here now means everything else failed. You wanted this, Richard said bitterly. No, Mr. Brennan. I wanted you to be better than this. I wanted Sterling Global to be what it claimed to be. I wanted your employees to work for a company that valued truth over appearance and people over profit. Instead, you refused to shake my hand and dismissed me as irrelevant. That told me everything I needed to know about whether Phoenix would be necessary. She left. Thomas followed her, carrying his laptop and looking back once at executives who suddenly seemed much smaller than they had an hour ago. The room erupted the moment the door closed. Board members argued. Marcus grabbed his phone to call emergency finance meetings. David pulled up legal precedents for trust challenges. Patricia sat quietly, watching Richard, waiting to see which version of the chairman would emerge from this crisis. Richard returned to his seat at the head of the table, but the position felt different now. Less like command and more like exposure. He'd spent 23 years building Sterling Global into a global powerhouse, and in less than 24 hours, a woman whose name he hadn't bothered to learn had reduced his empire to a choice between humiliating reform and catastrophic collapse. What do we do? Marcus asked quietly. Richard had no answer. For the first time in his career, he genuinely didn't know. The rest of that day unfolded like a controlled demolition. Within 2 hours of Naomi's departure, 3 major financial news outlets published stories about unusual capital movements at Sterling Global. The reports were vague, citing unnamed sources and preliminary data, but they were enough to trigger concern. Sterling Global's stock price dropped 4% before lunch, then another 3% by mid-afternoon. Trading volume spiked as nervous investors began repositioning their portfolios. Inside the company, different kinds of earthquakes were occurring. Word of the crisis meeting had spread despite security measures. Employees whispered in hallways and exchanged worried messages. Senior managers fielded anxious calls from partners and clients demanding explanations. The communications team drafted and redrafted press releases that said nothing while trying to sound reassuring. Marcus spent the afternoon in emergency sessions with his finance team, trying to calculate exactly how much damage Phoenix activation had caused. The numbers were worse than he'd initially thought. The $2.1 billion in isolated capital represented not just emergency reserves, but the foundation of Sterling Global's credit arrangements. Without access to those funds, the company's borrowing capacity dropped significantly. Credit lines would need renegotiation. Partner agreements would require amendment. International operations would need restructuring. David Foster's day was even worse. He'd begun reviewing the original Phoenix documentation with forensic attention, and every page revealed new problems. The system was more comprehensive than anyone had realized. It didn't just control capital reserves. It had monitoring authority over governance practices, compliance systems, and operational transparency. The trust could theoretically intervene in any area where executive decisions violated the conditions Sterling Global had agreed to 7 years ago. Conditions they'd agreed to and promptly forgotten. By late afternoon, the board convened an emergency session without Richard. Patricia had called the meeting, invoking seldom-used bylaws that allowed board members to deliberate on executive performance without executive presence. Richard learned about it from his assistant, who looked terrified to deliver the news. He paced his office while the board met 3 floors below, making decisions about his future without his input. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career making decisions about other people's futures without their input, without their consent, without even bothering to learn their names. Now the same process was being applied to him. His phone rang. A private number he didn't recognize. Richard Brennan. Mr. Brennan, this is Amanda Shaw from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm calling to inform you that we've received documentation regarding potential compliance irregularities at Sterling Global. We'll be opening a preliminary investigation. You should expect formal notification within 48 hours. The call ended before Richard could respond. He stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, understanding finally settling over him like cold water. Naomi hadn't been bluffing. The regulatory disclosure was already beginning, regardless of what decision he made. The choice she'd offered wasn't whether to cooperate, but whether to cooperate voluntarily or be forced into it. His office door opened without knocking, which never happened. Patricia entered, followed by two other board members. Their expressions told him everything before anyone spoke. The board has voted to place you on emergency administrative leave, effective immediately, Patricia said. The vote was 8-2. I'm sorry, Richard, but this is necessary. You can't do this. We can, and we have. David will assume interim CEO responsibilities until the board completes its review of the current situation. You'll retain your title as chairman, but will have no operational authority. Your corporate access will be suspended pending investigation. Investigation of what? I haven't done anything wrong. You signed off on multiple decisions that triggered Phoenix activation. You approved restructuring that concealed material risk. You dismissed compliance warnings as irrelevant. You treated oversight as optional. Whether you intended harm is irrelevant. Your decisions had consequences, and this board has a fiduciary responsibility to address those consequences. This is because of her, because of that woman and her automated system. This is because of you, Richard. Phoenix didn't create the problems at Sterling Global. It exposed them. If you'd taken compliance seriously, if you'd read the documents you signed, if you'd listened to warnings instead of dismissing them, we wouldn't be here. A security officer appeared in the doorway, holding an access card reader. Patricia gestured, and Richard understood what was about to happen. They were going to remove his credentials, strip his access, turn him into a visitor in the building he'd built. He pulled out his access card and placed it on the desk. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Patricia said, but it's a mistake we're choosing to make together, with full knowledge of the risks. That's more than you did when you made the decisions that brought us here. They left him alone. Richard stood in his office, surrounded by achievements and accolades and photographs of himself with presidents and celebrities and business leaders who'd sought his counsel. All of it felt hollow now, decorative, proof of a success that had never been as solid as it appeared. His phone buzzed with a news alert. CNN was reporting on Sterling Global's leadership changes. Anonymous sources claimed the chairman had been suspended amid financial irregularities. The market would respond accordingly when trading resumed tomorrow morning. Richard walked to the window and looked out over Manhattan again. The city still looked the same, but he was seeing it differently now. How many other buildings held executives making decisions without understanding consequences? How many other companies were running on assumptions that had never been examined? How many other empires were built on foundations their builders had never bothered to inspect? His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and for the first time in his life, Richard Brennan saw himself clearly. Not as the visionary leader he'd always believed himself to be, but as a man who'd mistaken confidence for competence and control for understanding. The woman whose hand he'd refused to shake had tried to tell him. She'd come to warn him, to give him one last chance to avoid this outcome. And he dismissed her without thought, without question, without even the basic courtesy of listening. That dismissal had cost him everything. Not because she'd been vindictive or cruel, but because he'd built a company where warnings from the wrong kind of people were automatically ignored, where power determined whose voice mattered and whose didn't, where someone could walk in with the knowledge to prevent disaster and be turned away because they didn't fit the chairman's mental image of what importance looked like. Phoenix hadn't destroyed Sterling Global. Richard had destroyed it himself, decision by decision, dismissal by dismissal, until the architecture he'd never bothered to understand finally responded the way it was designed to. He'd asked Naomi if there had been any way this ended differently. She told him yes. Yesterday, when she'd held out her hand. He understood now what she'd meant. Not that shaking her hand would have prevented Phoenix activation, but that the kind of leader who would refuse a handshake was exactly the kind of leader Phoenix was designed to stop. Richard pulled out his phone and typed a message he never thought he'd send. You were right. I am sorry. He sent it to the number Thomas had reluctantly provided, the number Naomi had used to send those emergency notifications he'd never read. The response came 3 minutes later. Apologies mean nothing without change. Show me you understand by supporting the reforms. Show me you're different by helping us rebuild what you broke. Richard read the message 3 times. Then he made the hardest decision of his career. He called Patricia and told her he would cooperate. Completely. Without condition. Whatever the trust required, whatever reforms were necessary, whatever consequences he faced, he would accept them. Not because he wanted to, but because for the first time in his life, he understood that wanting something didn't make him right about it. The empire was turning on itself, tearing down structures that had never been as strong as they appeared. And somewhere in Manhattan, Naomi Rivers was preparing for tomorrow, when the real work of rebuilding would begin. The following morning brought clarity that felt like surgery without anesthesia. Richard Brennan woke in his penthouse apartment to news coverage that dissected his career with the kind of thorough attention he'd once craved but now dreaded. Financial networks ran segments analyzing Sterling Global's leadership crisis. Journalists who'd praised him for decades now questioned his judgment, his oversight, his fundamental competence. The transformation from visionary to cautionary tale had taken less than 48 hours. He made coffee in a kitchen that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too much like a monument to success that no longer existed. His phone showed 63 missed calls and 214 unread messages. He ignored all of them except one text from Patricia, sent at 6 in the morning. Board meeting at 9. Your presence requested, but not required. We're moving forward with or without you. Richard arrived at Sterling Global headquarters at 8:30, entering through a side entrance to avoid the journalists camped outside the main lobby. Security had been instructed to let him pass, but not to restore his access credentials. He was escorted to the executive floor like a visitor, walking past offices where he'd once moved freely, nodding to employees who quickly looked away. The boardroom was already full when he arrived. Patricia sat at the head of the table, a position he'd occupied for 23 years. David Foster was present, looking marginally less exhausted than yesterday. Marcus Whitley sat with his hands folded, staring at nothing. Thomas Blake occupied a seat near the end, laptop open, apparently now important enough to attend board meetings. And Naomi Rivers sat against the wall, exactly where she'd been positioned 2 days ago when Richard had dismissed her as irrelevant. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Patricia called the meeting to order with efficient professionalism. Thank you all for coming on short notice. We have significant decisions to make and limited time to make them. The SEC investigation is proceeding. Media coverage is intensifying. Our stock price dropped another 6% in overseas markets. We need a plan. We need transparency, Naomi said quietly from her position against the wall. All eyes turned to her. The trust requirements are clear. Public disclosure of compliance failures. Executive accountability. Structural reform. The longer you delay, the more damage occurs. One of the board members, an older man named Gerald Hutchins who'd served since Sterling Global's founding, shook his head. Public disclosure will devastate investor confidence. We'll lose billions in market value. You're already losing billions, Thomas said, looking up from his laptop. The difference is whether you lose them while lying or while telling the truth. One path leads to recovery. The other leads to collapse. Listen to the junior analyst, Gerald muttered. This is what we've come to. This junior analyst, Patricia said firmly, has documented compliance failures that senior leadership ignored for 18 months. He's kept meticulous records that will protect this company when regulators finish their investigation. I suggest we listen to him. Richard remained silent, watching the dynamics shift around him. Patricia commanded the room with quiet authority. Thomas spoke with confidence that would have been unthinkable a week ago. Even Marcus, typically deferential to executive power, seemed to be finding his spine. The old order was dissolving, and Richard understood that fighting it would only make his fall more complete. I support full disclosure, he said. The room went quiet. Patricia is right. We need transparency, whatever the cost. Gerald stared at him. Richard, do you understand what you're saying? Full disclosure means admitting we concealed losses, suppressed compliance reports, and violated our own governance standards. The lawsuits alone will cripple us. The lawsuits are coming regardless, Naomi said. The question is whether they're filed against a company trying to reform or a company still denying reality. Trust me when I tell you that regulators and courts respond very differently to those two scenarios. How would you know? Gerald challenged. Because I've watched this play out before. 7 years ago, I watched executives at Morrison Financial choose denial over disclosure. They fought investigations, buried evidence, and attacked anyone who tried to hold them accountable. The company collapsed within 6 months. Shareholders lost everything. Employees lost their pensions. And the executives who caused the disaster walked away with golden parachutes while everyone else suffered. She paused, her voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. My father was a risk officer at Morrison Financial. He tried to warn them. He documented problems, filed complaints, followed every proper channel. They fired him, destroyed his reputation, and ensured he'd never work in finance again. He lost his career, his savings, and nearly his life trying to stop what happened. And he failed because people like Gerald insisted that protecting the company's image was more important than protecting the truth. The room was silent. Even Gerald looked uncomfortable. Phoenix exists because of Morrison Financial, Naomi continued. Because I watched my father's life destroyed by executives who chose comfort over courage. I built it to ensure that when the next crisis came, there would be a system that couldn't be silenced or fired or dismissed. A system that would force accountability even when human courage failed. Richard found his voice. Your father, is he still alive? Yes. Watching all of this unfold on the news. Wondering if Sterling Global will make the same choices Morrison Financial made, or if we've finally learned that truth survives longer than deception. Patricia cleared her throat. Then let's prove we've learned. I'm calling for a vote on full public disclosure of compliance failures, coordinated with regulatory authorities, to be issued within 72 hours. All in favor. 7 hands rose immediately. 2 remained down, including Gerald's. Patricia noted the count. Motion passes. David, work with Thomas and Naomi to prepare the disclosure documents. Make them comprehensive. Make them honest. And make them clear that Sterling Global is committed to reform, not cover up. David nodded, already making notes. Next item, Patricia continued. Board restructuring. Gerald, I'm asking for your resignation, effective immediately. Your opposition to transparency and reform makes you a liability this company cannot afford. Gerald's face flushed red. You can't force me out. I helped build this company. You helped build a company that prioritized appearance over accuracy. That's precisely the problem we're trying to fix. You can resign gracefully, or we can initiate removal proceedings. Your choice. Gerald stood, knocking his chair backward. This is a coup. You're using a crisis to eliminate anyone who disagrees with you. No, Patricia said calmly. We're using a crisis to eliminate anyone who can adapt to reality. There's a difference. Gerald stormed out. No one tried to stop him. Patricia waited until the door closed before continuing. We'll need new board members. People with compliance expertise, independent judgment, and no historical loyalty to the old power structure. Thomas, I'd like you to join the governance committee to help identify candidates. Thomas looked stunned. Ma'am, I'm 27 years old. I barely have the experience to. You have the courage to tell the truth when everyone else was hiding from it. That's the only qualification that matters right now. Richard watched this transformation with mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to fight, to reclaim his authority, to prove that he could still command a room. But a larger part recognized that fighting would accomplish nothing except confirming every criticism Naomi had made. He'd build a company where truth was treated as optional and power determined whose voice mattered. Watching that company tear itself down and rebuild on different foundations was painful, but it was also necessary. What about restitution? Marcus asked quietly. The trust requires victim compensation. Who are we compensating, and for what? Naomi pulled out yet another folder. I've compiled a preliminary list. Employees who were terminated for raising compliance concerns. Contractors who lost agreements when budget cuts concealed operational problems. partners who suffered losses because Sterling Global misrepresented its stability, investors who made decisions based on inaccurate disclosures. The list is substantial. How substantial? Approximately 400 individuals and 37 institutional partners with documented claims. Total estimated liability is between $800 million and $1.2 billion. Marcus went pale. We can't absorb that kind of loss. The Phoenix Trust can, Naomi said. That's part of why the capital was isolated, to ensure that when accountability came due, there would be resources available to meet it. So the money we thought was stolen is actually paying for our mistakes, Richard said slowly. Yes, though I'd argue they're not mistakes. Mistakes are accidental. These were choices. The distinction landed heavily. Around the table, executives who'd approved those choices looked uncomfortable. But no one argued. The evidence was too clear, too well documented, too impossible to deny. Patricia moved through the remaining agenda items with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized. Governance reforms, oversight mechanisms, compliance infrastructure, independent audit requirements. Every item represented a constraint on executive power, a check on the kind of unchallenged authority Richard had once wielded. By the time the meeting ended 3 hours later, Sterling Global had voted to transform itself from the inside out. The changes would be painful, expensive, difficult, but they would also be real. As people filed out, Richard found himself alone with Naomi for the first time since she'd explained Phoenix. She was gathering her documents, preparing to leave, and he realized this might be his only chance to ask the question that had been building since yesterday. Why didn't you destroy us completely? He asked. You had the power. You had the justification. Why stop at forcing reform? Naomi looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Because Phoenix wasn't built for destruction. It was built for correction. My father didn't want revenge against Morrison Financial. He wanted them to be better, to become the company they claimed to be. When that failed, when they chose collapse over change, it broke something in him. I built Phoenix to prevent that breaking, to create a system that would force change before collapse became inevitable. But we did become what you fought against. We made the same choices. Yes, but you also made different choices at the end. You cooperated. You supported disclosure. You didn't fight when the board removed your authority. That matters. That's the difference between correction and destruction. I only cooperated because I had no other option. Maybe you finally understood that the options you thought you had were never really there. That power built on deception isn't power at all. That the only sustainable authority comes from actually deserving it. Richard had no response to that. Naomi continued gathering her things, then paused at the door. There's something you should know, she said. The Phoenix Trust is deploying capital today. Pension guarantees for all Sterling Global employees. Contract fulfillment for partners affected by the crisis. Restitution payments to the people on my list. By tomorrow, everyone who suffered because of decisions you made will start receiving compensation. We can't afford that. You already paid for it. 7 years ago, when you approved the Phoenix architecture, the money was always meant for this. You just never bothered to understand what this meant. She left. Richard stood alone in the empty boardroom, surrounded by chairs where powerful people had just voted to dismantle the empire he'd built. He should have felt angry, betrayed, robbed of something he'd earned. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. The weight of maintaining an illusion was gone. The burden of pretending everything was fine while knowing it wasn't had lifted. For the first time in years, Richard Brennan wasn't managing appearances. He was simply existing in the truth of what he'd done and what it had cost. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Turn on Channel 7. Richard pulled up the news feed on the boardroom display. A reporter stood outside Sterling Global headquarters delivering a breaking story. In a stunning development, Sterling Global Enterprises has issued a comprehensive disclosure of internal compliance failures spanning the past 18 months. The company admits to concealing overseas losses, suppressing risk assessments, and violating its own governance standards. Chairman Richard Brennan has been suspended pending investigation. The board has announced sweeping reforms and victim restitution funded by an emergency capital trust established years ago. Financial analysts are calling this the most transparent corporate accountability action in recent history. The reporter continued, interviewing experts who praised Sterling Global's disclosure as unprecedented. Several noted that while the admission would damage short-term stock value, the long-term implications for corporate governance could be significant. One analyst said, "This is what accountability looks like. It's painful, but it's real." Richard turned off the display and left the boardroom. He took the elevator down to the lobby, walked past security, and exited through the main entrance where journalists immediately swarmed. He ignored their shouted questions and kept walking, moving through Manhattan streets that felt different somehow. Less judgmental, more honest. He found himself at a small park 6 blocks from Sterling Global headquarters, the same park where he used to eat lunch during the company's early years, before success had moved him into penthouses and private dining rooms where regular people weren't welcome. He sat on a bench and watched strangers live their lives, unaware that the man beside them had just lost an empire. His phone rang. "Patricia, where are you?" "Taking a walk." "Thinking. The disclosure is getting positive coverage. Analysts think we might actually survive this." "That's good." "Richard, the board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your permanent status. We need to know your intentions. Are you going to fight reinstatement, or are you ready to let go?" Richard watched a young mother push her child on a swing, the little girl laughing with pure, uncomplicated joy. "I'm ready to let go," he said. Sterling Global needs different leadership. Leaders who understand that power comes with responsibility. "I clearly didn't understand that." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. It doesn't feel right. It feels like failure. Maybe that's because you've spent your whole life avoiding failure instead of learning from it. This is your chance to learn." She hung up. Richard sat on the bench until the sun began setting, thinking about a career built on avoiding exactly the kind of reckoning he was experiencing now. He'd been so certain of his own brilliance, so confident in his judgment, so convinced that his success proved his methods were correct. He'd never seriously questioned whether the foundation was solid because the structure kept rising. Until it didn't. The following weeks brought changes that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Richard formally resigned as chairman, accepting a severance package substantially smaller than his contract specified, but larger than he deserved. David Foster was named permanent CEO, with Patricia as board chair. Thomas Blake was promoted to director of compliance oversight, reporting directly to the board rather than through executive channels. The organizational chart was redrawn to prevent the kind of concentrated power Richard had wielded. Gerald Hutchins filed a lawsuit challenging his removal, claiming the board had violated proper procedures. The suit was dismissed within 3 weeks when evidence emerged of his personal knowledge of compliance failures he'd actively helped conceal. 2 other executives resigned under pressure. Several more accepted demotions in exchange for avoiding termination. Sterling Global's stock price stabilized at 15% below its pre-crisis level, then slowly began recovering as investors recognized that the company was genuinely reforming rather than simply managing appearances. Quarterly earnings dropped significantly, but analysts noted that the numbers were now trustworthy, which represented substantial value in a corporate environment where accounting accuracy was increasingly questioned. The Phoenix Trust deployed $2.1 billion exactly as Naomi had described. Pension obligations were guaranteed in full. Contractor agreements were honored. Restitution payments went out to 419 individuals who'd been harmed by Sterling Global's deceptions. The remaining capital was placed in oversight funds designed to maintain governance reforms and prevent future executive overreach. Naomi declined all requests for media interviews. She issued a single statement through her attorney explaining that Phoenix was designed as a systemic intervention, not a personal achievement, and that the focus should remain on Sterling Global's reforms rather than the mechanism that forced them. The statement was characteristically clear and notably absent of self-congratulation. Richard read that statement from his apartment, where he'd spent most of the past month adjusting to a life without corporate authority. He'd received dozens of calls from headhunters, board recruiters, and consulting firms interested in his expertise. He declined all of them. Whatever value his experience held was tainted by the circumstances of his departure. He needed time to understand what had happened before he could credibly advise anyone else. One afternoon, 6 weeks after Phoenix activation, Richard received a package delivered by courier. No return address. Inside was a single folder containing documentation of the Phoenix Trust's final report. The trust had completed its mandate. Capital had been deployed. Reforms had been implemented. Oversight mechanisms were operational. The system was now transferring remaining authority back to Sterling Global's restructured board. A handwritten note was attached. The system worked because you finally let it. That's worth acknowledging. What you do with this second chance will determine whether you learned anything from the first one. Choose wisely. It wasn't signed, but Richard recognized the handwriting from documents he'd finally bothered to read. He thought about his father, who'd built a modest but honest business and died, disappointed that his son had pursued size over integrity. He thought about the employees whose pensions he'd nearly destroyed through negligence disguised as strategy. He thought about Naomi's father, whose career had been sacrificed to protect executives who hadn't deserved protection. And he thought about the woman whose hand he'd refused to shake, who'd tried to warn him, who'd built a system capable of forcing accountability when human courage failed. Richard picked up his phone and composed a message to an email address Thomas had reluctantly provided. "I'm ready to learn, if you're willing to teach." The response came 3 days later. "Teaching implies you're still important enough for my time. You're not. But if you're serious about understanding what you did wrong and how to do better, I can recommend people who've actually earned the right to guide that journey. First step, stop thinking of this as about you. It was never about you. It was about everyone your decisions affected. Once you understand that distinction, we can talk." Richard read the message 4 times, then smiled despite himself. She was right, of course. He'd been approaching this as a personal rehabilitation project, another achievement to add to his resume. The real work was understanding that his rehabilitation was the least important outcome of everything that had happened. He began reading books about corporate governance, ethical leadership, systemic accountability. He reached out to former employees, not to defend himself, but to listen to their experiences. He attended community lectures on business ethics, sitting in the back, taking notes like a student rather than an expert. Slowly, painfully, Richard Brennan began learning what Naomi Rivers had tried to teach him from the beginning. That power not grounded in truth was just performance, and performance always ended when the audience stopped believing. A year after Phoenix activation, Sterling Global held its annual leadership gala. The event was smaller, less ostentatious, held at a conference center rather than the plaza. The guest list included employees from all levels, not just executives and major investors. The dress code was business casual, not black tie. Everything about it signaled that the old order had genuinely changed. Patricia gave the keynote address, speaking about the importance of institutional courage and structural accountability. She acknowledged the crisis that had forced these changes, praised the employees who documented problems when leadership ignored them, and committed Sterling Global to maintaining transparency even when convenient lies were available. Thomas sat at a table with other governance committee members, looking more comfortable in his authority, but still maintaining the idealism that made him valuable. David Foster circulated through the crowd, speaking with department heads about operational challenges and listening rather than lecturing. The atmosphere was professional but human, powerful but honest. Richard watched from outside through the conference center windows. He'd been invited but had declined, recognizing that his presence would distract from message. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk, observing a company that no longer needed him, and feeling grateful that it didn't. A voice spoke behind him. "Enjoying the view?" He turned to find Naomi standing there, dressed casually, carrying a bag that suggested she'd just finished grocery shopping or some other ordinary errand. She looked at the conference center, then at him. "Not what you built," she observed. "No, it's better." "Do you mean that? Or are you performing humility because you think I want to hear it?" Richard considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have been performing. Today, I actually mean it. Sterling Global needed to become something I wasn't capable of building. I'm glad it did. Naomi studied him for a long moment. My father watched your resignation speech. He said you looked like someone finally waking up from a dream where you convince yourself you were someone you weren't. That's accurate. How is your father? Better. Watching Phoenix work the way it was designed gave him something he'd been missing. Not revenge. Validation. Proof that what he tried to do mattered, even if he didn't live to see it implemented. I'd like to meet him. To apologize. For what? You didn't work at Morrison Financial. You didn't fire him. No, but I made the same choices the people who did fire him made. I built the same kind of company. I would have done the same thing to someone like him if it had protected my interests. He should know that I understand that now. Naomi was quiet. Then she said, he lives in Philadelphia. I visit every other weekend. If you're serious, you can come with me next time. But if you're doing this to make yourself feel better, stay home. He doesn't need your therapy session. I'm serious. She nodded. Then I'll text you details. Be ready to listen and not talk. My father doesn't need your explanations. He needs to know that someone like you finally understands why people like him matter. She walked away before Richard could respond. He watched her disappear into the evening crowds. This woman who dismantled his empire with nothing but his own rules and the patience to wait for him to break them. Inside the conference center, Patricia finished her speech to sustained applause. Employees returned to conversations that mixed business with genuine human connection. Sterling Global continued operating, not as the monument to individual brilliance it had once been, but as the collective effort it should have been all along. Richard turned and walked home through Manhattan streets that no longer felt like territory he controlled, but like space he shared with everyone else. His apartment was smaller now, affordable rather than ostentatious, located in a neighborhood where no one knew or cared that he used to be important. He made dinner in a kitchen that didn't require staff, watched news that occasionally mentioned Sterling Global without mentioning him, and went to sleep without the weight of maintaining an empire that had never been as stable as it appeared. 2 weeks later, Richard took a train to Philadelphia with Naomi. They barely spoke during the journey. She read reports on her tablet. He reviewed notes he'd prepared about Morrison Financial's collapse, trying to understand not just what had happened, but why his instinct would have been to make the same choices. Naomi's father lived in a modest row house in a quiet neighborhood. He answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, looking older than Richard expected but sharper. His eyes assessed Richard with the kind of thoroughness that came from decades of evaluating risk. Mr. Rivers, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I didn't agree to anything. My daughter asked if I was willing to listen to someone who finally understands what I tried to tell Morrison Financial before they destroyed themselves. I'm listening because I trust her judgment. They sat in a living room filled with books about financial systems, regulatory theory, and corporate governance. Richard recognized several titles he'd been reading himself. On the wall hung a photograph of a younger Naomi receiving some kind of academic award, her father standing beside her with obvious pride. I wanted to tell you that I understand now, Richard began. What you try to do at Morrison Financial. Why you documented problems. Why you filed complaints. Why you kept trying even when everyone told you to stop. I understand, because I was on the other side of that equation. I was the executive who would have dismissed you as paranoid or disloyal or unable to understand the bigger picture. Naomi's father listened without interrupting. I built a company where people like you didn't matter, Richard continued. Where warnings were treated as disloyalty and truth was negotiable. Where power determined whose voice counted and whose didn't. Your daughter built a system that forced me to see what I'd been ignoring. And now I'm trying to learn how to be the kind of person who doesn't need to be forced. Why? Mr. Rivers asked simply. Because the alternative is being the kind of person who destroys things without meaning to and never understands why the destruction matters. Mr. Rivers nodded slowly. My daughter showed me the disclosure documents Sterling Global released. They were honest, comprehensive. They didn't minimize or deflect or blame others. That's rare. It was painful. Truth usually is. But it's sustainable in a way that lies never are. They talked for 2 hours. Mr. Rivers described his time at Morrison Financial, The warnings he'd issued, the retaliation he'd faced, the helplessness of watching disaster approach, while everyone insisted he was overreacting. Richard listened without defending executives he'd never met, but whose thought processes he recognized in himself. When it was time to leave, Mr. Rivers walked them to the door. He shook Naomi's hand, then paused before offering the same gesture to Richard. "My daughter says you're trying to learn. That matters. But what you do with that learning matters more. Don't waste this chance to become someone better than who you were." Richard shook his hand. "I won't." On the train back to New York, Naomi finally spoke. "That went better than I expected." "What were you expecting?" "Him telling you to leave. That your apologies meant nothing. That people like you never really change." "Does he believe I can change?" "He believes you might." That's more than he believed about Morrison Financial's executives. They fought until the end, convinced they were right. You at least admitted you were wrong. That's a start. Richard looked out the window at landscape passing in the darkness. "Your father asked why I wanted to learn. I'm still not sure I gave him the right answer." "What would the right answer be?" "I don't know. Maybe that I'm tired of being someone whose legacy is serving as a cautionary tale. Maybe that I finally understand my success was built on other people's sacrifices. Maybe that watching you dismantle everything I built taught me more about leadership than building it ever did." "Those are all true," Naomi said, "but they're also all about you. The real answer is probably simpler than that." "What's the simple answer?" "That being the person who causes harm hurts less than being the person who recognizes the harm they caused. You're finally recognizing it. That pain is proof you're not the person you were." Richard thought about that for the rest of the journey home. 6 months later, Sterling Global published its first full-year report under new governance. Profits are modest but sustainable. Employee satisfaction was the highest it had been in a decade. Compliance scores had improved dramatically. The company wasn't the largest in its sector anymore, but it was arguably the most trusted. Naomi published a detailed case study of Phoenix activation, making the architecture available to other companies and consultants interested in implementing similar safeguards. The paper was careful not to sensationalize Sterling Global's crisis, but instead focused on systemic design principles for automated governance intervention. Thomas was offered positions at 3 larger companies, all of which promised more money and prestige. He declined them, choosing to stay at Sterling Global, where his voice actually mattered and his work created real change. Richard started consulting for a nonprofit that helped executives understand the difference between authority and accountability. He worked with leaders who'd experienced similar crises, helping them recognize patterns they'd been too close to see. He never mentioned his own story unless specifically asked, preferring to let the lessons speak for themselves. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when Manhattan felt less like a monument to achievement and more like a community of people trying to build something worthwhile, Richard would think about the woman whose hand he'd refused to shake and the empire she'd dismantled by following his own rules. He'd asked if there was any way it could have ended differently. She told him yes. Yesterday, when she'd held out her hand. Richard understood now. The handshake wasn't the moment that mattered. The handshake was a symptom of something deeper. The willingness to see someone. The curiosity to ask who they were instead of assuming. The humility to recognize that importance wasn't determined by titles or appearances, but by what people knew and what they'd built. Phoenix had forced him to learn that lesson the hard way. But he learned it, and that learning, painful and expensive as it had been, turned out to be the only thing from his old life worth keeping. Power wasn't what you held, Naomi had said. It was what still moved when you were ignored. Richard finally understood what she meant. Real power didn't come from controlling people. It came from building systems so true and necessary that they functioned regardless of who stood at the top. Phoenix rose because the foundation was stronger than any individual. And Sterling Global survived because, in the end, enough people chose truth over comfort. That was the legacy Richard Brennan would leave. Not an empire, but a lesson about what happens when power forgets to listen. And in the quiet moments when he thought about everything he'd lost, he realized he'd gained something more valuable. The ability to recognize worth in people he once would have dismissed. The humility to learn from those he'd thought beneath him. and the understanding that the woman whose hand he'd refused to shake had offered him something more valuable than any greeting. She'd offered him accountability, and when he'd rejected it, she'd built a system that would deliver it anyway. For that, more than anything else, Richard Brennan was grateful. When someone extends their hand to you, are you seeing who they really are, or just who you've decided they should be? If you enjoyed this story about hidden power and hard-earned accountability, like this video and subscribe for more stories that make you think. What will you watch next?